Folks, we are at NASCA's Summit on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and we've just been in the room, which is right there, and now we're out of the room because we're right here, and I'm standing with Dara Barlin from the Center for
Transforming Culture.
Transforming Culture.
Indeed.
There we go. I love it. So I just watched Dara on stage, and it was incredible. She's got this just energy about the topic at hand, which is how we're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, like building that in to our organizations, how we're transforming culture. I thought it was brilliant. So thank you for one.
Thank you. I thought you were brilliant as well,
Oh,
if I may
stop.
say so.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I got to follow this act, and it was a tough one to follow. But we got to hang out, and we've been just chatting here as we were getting cameras set up and like prepped for this NASCA podcast. And I think all of the good content happened before we were recording.
What can you do?
Yeah, right? No, we can just have the conversation again. So I loved your approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And I think particularly as we think about state governments, DEI is hard because we've got a huge mix of people, some of whom agree that we ought to be having the conversation and some of whom are just burnt out on the conversation and some who haven't fully oriented to the conversation. So like, can we start with kind of owning some of that tension? How does that show up in your work and the work that you do?
And I'm going to throw in one more group
Okay.
for some people who feel attacked by the conversation.
Oh, hey, yeah.
Simply talking about it sort of trigger people. I'm a big brain science nerd, so I like to talk about the amygdala, right? Which like puts us into fight or flight mode. And so you mentioned the word DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion.
Or any one of those three words,
Any one of
right?
those, right?
Yeah.
And then it just triggers people's amygdala, and then they start freaking out, right? And they feel attacked by the conversation, even though, you know, we're trying to create this space of empathy where inclusiveness, where everyone feels welcome.
Sure.
There are people who themselves feel unwelcome and attacked that this space isn't for them. And so that's a whole nother can of worms, but part of the ball game.
Well, let's pop that can of worms a little bit, right?
Oh,
Let's
let's
set
do
the
it.
terminology aside.
Okay.
The stuff that might trigger the amygdala.
Yeah.
Let's just talk about creating an environment where people feel included. That seems good.
That seems good.
Okay, so we're on the same page there.
Yeah.
What does it take to start building that culture? Like, how do we start doing some of that work?
I mean, so it's really interesting because you talk about these different people on different parts of the spectrum, everyone with a different relationship to DEIB, and how do we get them starting to listen to each other and move each other all in the same direction, right? And in my world, and this is not always popular, but in my world, this I talk about 360 empathy.
Okay.
Right? So how do we all have empathy for each other, understand where people are feeling excluded, and how to help everyone feel seen and valued and respected.
Valued, respected.
Yeah, and how do we do that in the workplace? And what does that look like? And how do we start creating language and practices that make everyone feel included? And that's, you know, it's a little tricky, but I think it's doable.
Yeah. Can I pull? We throw that word empathy out a lot.
Yeah.
Like, do you have a definition for empathy? How do you define empathy? Is maybe a better way to ask that. I'm putting you on the spot.
That's a tough one.
It is.
That's a tough one.
And I'm happy to offer one because I feel like we're probably thinking about a lot of the same things. So
I'm going to get myself out of this hole because you just offered me an easy out.
I did. I offered you an out.
Please,
As
offer
a
away.
good interviewer, I have offered you an out because I threw you in the
Sweet.
spot.
I'm in.
Empathy, our ability to put ourselves in another person's shoes and see the world through their eyes with the things that they care about and the things that they hope for and the things that they fear. It's to put ourselves in their shoes and see the world the way they see it.
And you know, I feel like we learned this in grade school. Like,
right?
I mean, grade school we learn that you put yourself in another man's shoes, and now it's put yourself in another person's shoes. But the idea is, you know, we've been learning this through grade school, and yet the concept, it's so hard for people. Like, it's such an easy way that we can think about, and you can sort of let people know, like, hey, yeah, see yourself from their perspective. But the actual act of trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, it's really hard for a lot of people, for most people. And especially there are other things that compete that actually make it harder. Like, and one of the biggest things is time stress. So, right? So when you have time stress, there's actually a study. They did one, ABC redid the study on the Good Samaritan. And what they said, they saw, they had these actors. They hired these actors to be on campus with their shoes off, and they were crying. And then they hired some folks to let people know that the subjects were going to be on ABC and get their big break for being good Samaritans. And these were people who were told, you're a good Samaritan, and so you're going to get your big break. All you got to do is read this parable on the Good Samaritan and then go cross campus and talk about it on ABC.
Yeah.
And for half of the people, they actually said, you got plenty of time, get there when you get there, you're fine. And for the other half, they actually said, you're in a time rush, you might miss your chance, you got to get there in a rush.
I know
right?
where this is
You
going.
know
I
where
feel
this is going,
cool.
right? And so the people who crossed over would see the actors on the side of the road, and they wanted to see how many of these Good Samaritans who stopped
Huh.
and paid attention to these poor guys who were really in bad shape. And basically, you can guess, what percent of the people
I'd go with 30% stopped.
who were
in a rush.
Who were in a rush.
Yeah,
That-
and probably 60% who weren't.
I think that goes up to about 70 to 80% who
Really?
weren't break. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So the time rush, actually, when people are in a time rush, it makes us less empathetic. And I don't know about you, I've worked in a lot of contexts in government agencies and state agencies that are responsible for implementing policy after policy and these huge things with crazy timelines. How many of them have plenty of time on their hands?
The very, very few.
I have
imagine.
met zero people watching this
I was being
podcast
polite.
have
Yeah,
plenty of
none of
time
you.
on their hands, right? Like, how many of you have so much time stress that you don't think you can get anything that, like, you can't get stuff done during the day that's on your basic to-do list, right? And so
We're eroding our ability to empathize.
eroding our ability to
Wow.
empathize simply because of how busy we are,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so if we really want to create a commitment to DEI, we got to start with, like, having a commitment to ourselves and giving empathy for ourselves, right? To say we need space and time to breathe here and think about these things and manifest them in a way that can actually create empathy for each other.
And can I take that maybe a step further on the empathy for ourselves, right? To stand in a person's shoes and see the world the way they see it. Like, to your point, doing that for ourselves, pausing to maybe consider that we have some biases and that those biases might be detrimental to the people we work with. Like, we don't often create time because we're so busy.
Yeah.
And we're moving so quickly
Yeah.
and we've got the internet in the palm of our hand and
Right.
we don't pause to say, what do I actually believe and what
Yeah.
biases did I just inherit and
Yeah.
never challenge
Yeah.
or go any deeper to explore? Like, that space you're talking about seems really, really important, which
made you curious about focusing on culture in government?
Sure. Well, it came from our members. We really listened to our members and heard from them that this work is critical, it's vital. What we're seeing is that they can't fill jobs. There's labor shortages everywhere. And so as we're talking about the workforce, DEI comes right into the conversation. It all ties into recruitment, hiring, retention, employee engagement. And so it's just part of the conversation that has to be had.
Why do you think culture is so important in thinking about human-centered leadership? Why is it so valuable in government settings specifically?
Yeah, no, I mean, culture dictates how we as humans interact with each other. If we're not intentional about building culture, it doesn't mean we won't end up with culture. It just means we won't have designed it intentionally.
What's the default culture? Like, so if you're not intentional about culture, what will it revert to?
We revert to a culture predicated on humans doing the things humans do, which is often going to our baser instincts, right? The biases that we were taught, the biases that are unconscious, the biases that we hold on to and haven't explored, right? Those things will start to surface very quickly when we're threatened or we're pressured.
And what does it do to policy? What does it do to policy implementation to have the ugliest parts of ourselves in that frame?
Yeah, I laugh. I mean, it's not laughable because we've seen the repercussions of the ugly parts of us as we're hyperpolarized in our country today, as we're grappling with a globally traumatic experience, a collectively traumatic experience. So we're grappling with the repercussions of the summer of racial reckoning post George Floyd. Like all of those pieces, we're seeing some ugly surface. And if we're not really careful about that, that creeps into or dives into policy, right? The policies, because we're feeling a way and put a bill on the table, and that bill works its way through our legislatures and ends up being a piece of legislation that affects hundreds of thousands and millions of people.
We just had this really awesome conversation about DEI, and we talked about how tough it is to talk about DEI a little bit. And I wonder if you had some opinions on why it's so tough. I mean, you had some really thoughtful contributions. I wonder if you could share with the audience, why is it so tough to talk about?
But even your most seasoned, as far as seasons in the work, sometimes they have just been exposed during the earliest seasons, or they didn't have a unique interaction that left them with a certain mindset that they can't adjust. And sometimes people are reluctant to change because change in itself is scary.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I once read a statement like sometimes people stick to dysfunction because they don't know how to function in a normal situation. So they'll cling to that because they're equipped for that. So like you said, when you're around like-minded individuals and they all feel a certain way, you find a level of comfortability. It takes a brave person to step out and to say, hey, I'm going to try something different, and not to have an entourage behind them to support and endorse it.
What are some of the strategies that they're using or that you're seeing that are popping up?
Well, that goes in so many different directions. You know, we could look at recruitment strategies, hiring strategies, engagement and retention strategies. But probably the most important one is those employees that are working, how do we keep them engaged into the work that they're doing every day? How do we connect them to the agency, the department, and their strategic goals so that they come to work wanting to do the work and that they're happy and focused? So the employee engagement piece is a huge component that all of our members are talking about right now.
So if I was a manager coming in from the cold and I have my team and I'm hearing about, I need to engage my employees more, like, I don't know, I'm like culture, what are we doing around culture?
Yeah.
What would be something that you would tell me as a manager in this government context how would I even go about learning how to do that work? Because all I've known is like my timelines and deliverables and getting things out the door. How do I make this shift? What would be the first thing that you would tell me?
So the work doesn't stop.
Yeah.
Right? We still have to get the work done. The projects
yeah.
still have to be implemented.
Yeah.
Everything that the governor asks still has to occur. But you have to get to know your employees. That's the whole component around this inclusion and belonging. Get to know them. Talk to them.
Yeah.
Ask them, what's important to you? Do you want a flexible schedule? How can we recognize you? How can we celebrate success? How can you show your voice and be more engaged in the work that we're doing? So oftentimes we consider state government just this top-down approach, and it's told to employees. Well, we need to flip that. And we need to listen to our employees and totally engage them in that conversation.
So the thing about it that, even pretending in my role play that I'm the manager, I'm starting to feel, oh my God, hey, I don't know how to do all that, and how much time is this going to take, and is that going to pull me away from all that? What would you recommend to someone who is sort of in that space right now that is just freaking out? Like, wow, how am I going to do all that and then try to get to know my employees?
Sure. So, a couple of just very easy strategies. Weekly huddles.
Yeah.
Get folks together, have those conversations. Yes, part of it has to be about the work, the projects. Where are we? What do our timelines look like? What are our deadlines? But then asking those employees, how are you doing?
Yeah.
How's it going? How's your work-life balance? So that's great in a community, in that like weekly huddle. But then maybe those one-time-a-week sync-ups where you're just one-on-one with an individual. Again, you're digging into their work. You're learning what they're experiencing, asking them, how is your role going with our agency? Not only do you get to know their professional lives, but often you get some of that personal sprinkled in as well.
Yeah.
And that's how those individuals start to feel that sense of care and belonging and inclusion.